Welcome back to One Dish Breakdowns, the series where I'm taking one dish at a time and figuring out as many skills and tips and tricks that I can possibly teach you from just cooking one dish. And this series came about because I was cooking with my friend Juan, who was a beginner cook, who really didn't have too many skills in the kitchen. And through cooking with him, I was realizing how many skills that I take for granted that are just super natural to me, but they might not be natural to a lot of you. So for episode 3, I'm back cooking with Juan, and he wanted to learn how to cook a steak dinner. Super standard stuff, but you can learn so many skills in the kitchen just from cooking a basic steak dinner. So we're gonna be breaking down everything you need to know about cooking steak. We're gonna make a few side dishes, and hopefully you're gonna learn a ton along the way. So before we get started cooking, we gotta pick a steak first, which is tip number 1, picking the proper steak, which can be very overwhelming because there's a ton of different cuts, there's different names for those cuts, but basically steaks come from the upper back region of the cow. And the reason people love steaks so much is because that area on the cow only moves when the cow goes side to side, making it very tender compared to the other muscles on the cow that are moving all the time, making them tougher. So you don't have to cook a steak that long for it to be super delicious and very tender. So when it comes to cooking steak at home, there's 4 main cuts that you should know about. You've got the sirloin, you've got the ribeye, you've got the filet, and you have the strip steak. And they all have their pros and cons. It's really a preference thing. I would suggest you trying them out over time, seeing what you like the best. For instance, the ribeye is delicious because it's super fatty, but some people don't like it so fatty, whereas the filet is super tender, but it's a little harder to cook because it doesn't have that fat to protect you from overcooking your steak. So I'm going with the strip steak, also called a New York strip steak, and the first thing you've got to make sure you do is dry off that steak. Whatever packaging it comes in, a lot of times your steak is going to be giving off a little moisture, and if it's not patted dry, you're going to be boiling your steak and not getting that delicious crust that you want. And I chose a strip steak because I like the balance of this steak. It's not too fatty, but it's not too lean. It's right in between. You can see all of that marbling in the steak, and really that's just fat that's running through the muscle that when it breaks down is going to keep your steak nice and juicy. And most strip steaks will have a chunk of fat running down the side, and this is different than the marbling that's going through the fat. And when I was talking to Juan, he didn't want that fat on the side. He didn't like the chewiness of it. So that's tip number 3. Don't be scared to trim that extra fat. There's no problem with that. Actually, I prefer trimming that fat because that fat isn't going to render down like the interior marbling. That fat will probably end up being chewy, so you can trim that off. And what I'm gonna do is just chop it up into little pieces. So we're still gonna use that, but you'll see that in a later tip. The 4th tip is you want to make sure that you heavily salt your steak because that salt has to carry through the entire steak. It's a pretty thick piece and you're not getting any seasoning on the interior of the steak. You would have to brine it or let it marinate for days to get it on the inside. So make sure you have a good amount of salt so it can carry through and season the entire bite. Number 5 is once that steak is salted, you want to make sure you leave it out at room temperature for at least 30 minutes before you cook it. You can definitely go longer than that, and this is where people get a little scared. They don't like the idea of leaving meat out at room temperature. They think it always has to be refrigerated, but if it's not at room temperature, if it's coming straight from the coldness of the refrigerator and goes into a hot pan, it's going to lower the temperature of the pan, which is not good for getting a nice crust. So you want to make sure it's warmed up a bit before it goes into the pan. And also by leaving it there with the salt on it, you can see it's starting to sweat a bit. Some of that moisture is being pulled from the top layer of the steak, which is great for developing a good crust. If we can get some of that moisture out, it's really going to help our crust development in the long term. So now that the steak is prepped, it's coming to room temperature, we can move on to some side dishes. And I asked Juan what he wanted to make to complete the dinner, and he said broccoli. He actually said sauteed broccoli, which is perfect because that's a classic combination with a steak dinner. But I told him that sauteed broccoli probably isn't the best bet, because when you're sauteing something, you don't have as much surface area. So if we were to saute in a pan, you could see you could only get a few florets in there. So I told him, let's roast the broccoli, because when you roast, you're doing it on a big baking sheet. So you have so much more surface area. And when you have more surface area, you have more contact on the vegetables, which means you can cook more at once. You get more browning, which ultimately leads to more flavor. So we are going with roasted broccoli. To prep the broccoli, all you have to do is cut off the florets in even pieces. And then a bonus tip is you can definitely use the rest of the broccoli. A lot of people would throw this away, but that is delicious. Roasted broccoli stems are incredible. So what I do is I just take the stem and go around it and just chop up some pieces. And these pieces can be a little smaller because they're more dense than the florets. So they're gonna take a little longer to cook, and you can keep chopping that up until you get to the very end. That's where it gets a bit tough, and you can just throw that piece out. So tip number 7 is saving on cleaning by using less dishes. So in this case, instead of putting the broccoli in a bowl and seasoning it, we can go right onto the roasting pan by just adding some olive oil to the pan, adding the broccoli, and then just mixing that up with your hands until all of the broccoli is well coated with the olive oil. Because one of the main reasons people don't cook is the cleanup. So it's always good to be thinking about how to minimize your cleanup, and by using less dishes, boom, you're saving time. So I turned my oven on 450 degrees, which is a great roasting temperature. You want a nice high heat to roast vegetables properly. And I let that preheat for about 10 minutes. And right before I threw the broccoli in the oven, I actually wrapped up a potato in some tin foil and just threw that on the tray. Because Juan had mentioned making mashed potatoes, and the dish definitely needed something else, but mashed potatoes just felt a little too complex for a beginner with all of these other things going on. So I figured by just roasting a potato, that would be a really simple side dish that won't overwhelm the entire cooking process. Now tip number 8 is when your broccoli is roasting, you don't want to mess with it. Every time you open the oven, you're losing a ton of heat. And we preheated that oven, we got it prepared to roast properly. So when you keep opening it and messing with the vegetables, you're not gonna get a great roast. You're not gonna get good color. So you just wanna let that hang out. As long as you have enough oil on the veggies, you shouldn't have any issues with burning. And if you just keep that there for like 12 minutes, those things are going to be crispy. So I checked them at about 12 minutes and they looked good, but they weren't perfect. So that takes us to our next tip, which is using your intuition, feeling things out in the cooking process. So if you open the oven and they just don't look like they should, put them back in there, let them roast a little longer. Your oven could be a little less hot than someone else's oven. There's a lot of different factors at play, so just feel it out. Don't be so attached to a recipe or, someone telling you a certain way to do it. So now that our broccoli's finished roasting, I took that out of the oven, but I let the potato hang out in the oven a little longer because it's gonna take a much longer time to cook. And now it's time to cook our steak. And the question is, what pan do we use to cook our steak? A lot of people have issues figuring out the right pan to use. So the next tip is always use your heaviest pan. You want a pan that's nice and thick, that's gonna retain a lot of heat, that's gonna give you a nice even cook. So in my dream world, I'm using the cast iron. That's my favorite pan for cooking steak inside, but using a cast iron properly can be a bit challenging, and we'll save that for another video. So I'm just going with this heavier nonstick pan that I have. So now that we've got our pan picked out, what oil do we use? Well, you remember that fat that we cut off earlier? We can repurpose that fat. We're gonna stay within the cow family and just use the fat that came off that actual steak and render that down. So all you have to do is take those pieces, put your pan on a medium heat, and just start rendering down those pieces, which is great because one, we get a delicious cooking oil that's gonna give you extra flavor on your steak. Number two, it's free. It didn't cost you any extra money. And number three, those little pieces, once they're rendered down, that is like steak bacon. It is so delicious. Much better than chewing on a fatty piece of steak. So once you've rendered down your fat, you've got your cooking oil, you can always dump some off if it's too much. And the next tip is making sure your pan is properly preheated before the steak goes in. You don't want a cold pan. You'll never develop a crust if you put your steak into a cold pan. So what I like to do, with caution of course, is just hold my hand over the pan about 2 inches above the pan. And if it's uncomfortable after like 2 to 5 seconds, that's a good sign that your pan is preheated and your steak is ready to go in the oil. So let's talk about cooking your actual steak. And there's so many different techniques for cooking steak. There's some crazy ones out there. You've got the reverse sear, you've got the sous vide, you've got flipping it a million times. I've tried pretty much everything, but I always tend to go back to the same technique, which is pretty simple. Just giving it a really hard sear on both sides, developing a nice crust, and then finishing it off at a low heat in the oven just to make sure it is cooked through. So that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna develop that crust. Just let it sit on one side and really sizzle away. And you can check that after a few minutes just to see where your crust is at. And right at this point, it was pretty good. I could tell it was about 30 seconds to a minute away. You're just looking for a nice even brownness throughout the entire crust. And then it was time to flip it and give it that brown on the other side. So the next tip is taking advantage of convection heat, which means heat coming from all sides. Right now we are cooking with direct heat. The steak is touching the hot surface of the pan, which is great for developing a crust, but it's not always great for cooking your steak all the way through, because if you're just using direct heat, it's very easy to overcook your steak. So right when the steak is done, I like throwing it in a very low temperature oven, like 250 degrees, which is just gonna cook the steak through a bit. It's going to render out the last of that fat and make sure it's nice and pink on the inside, but not red, not rare, because I like my steaks medium rare. Once your steak has been in the oven for a few minutes, just feel the surface. If it has a little bit of give, that's a good sign. You don't want it to be super firm, but you don't want it to be super bouncy. Somewhere in between should be a good medium rare. And when that's ready, you're gonna take the steak out and you need to let it rest a bit because the juices need time to reabsorb, to settle a bit in the steak. If you cut into it right away, they're going to just drip right out and you'll have a dry steak. You need that juice. It's pretty ironic that I overcooked this steak just slightly. This is more of a medium than a medium rare, like I enjoy my steaks. But you know, that's another tip I would say. Don't be so hard on yourself. This stuff happens in the kitchen. You're not perfect every time. Next time you'll get better. You won't make the same mistakes. For me, I'm filming. It's tough to film and cook, and I think I just threw it in the oven for slightly too long. Maybe the oven had a lot of heat in there from roasting the broccoli. Because I turned it down from 450 to 250, I think there was a lot of heat still in the oven rather than just putting the oven on 250. So I learned, and you know, hopefully next time I'll perfect it. So when I was cooking with Juan, we had the steak and the broccoli ready, but the potato was taking a long time. Potatoes take an eternity to cook through. So we wanted to eat. We didn't want the steak to get super cold. So we just pulled the potato out, and I was feeling the potato and the fork was going in, but I could tell that it was still a little hard on the inside. So the next tip is calling an audible, going off course a little bit, because with cooking, things are constantly going wrong. They're not turning out how you want them to turn out, and you need to be able to think on the spot and change things up a bit. So for me, what I did was I took out the potato and then I sliced it up into little rounds rather than keeping it like a whole roasted potato. And then I had all of that delicious steak juice. So I took that steak juice and I added in some butter just to really amp it up. And this happened to be some garlic butter, which was a bonus, extra flavor. And then I put those pieces right into that butter oil steak mixture and started frying those off and finishing the cooking process. And these little fry rounds were so delicious. They came out great. And it's something that a recipe probably wouldn't have told me to do. It came from something going wrong and just being free in the kitchen and freestyling a little bit.
Woo! Crispy.
So there you go, that is a complete steak dinner right there. I hope these tips helped you out. For me, I think the most important tip is always remembering that things don't necessarily work out the way you imagine them in your head. I would say 95% of the time I have this idea of the way a dish is going to turn out, and it usually doesn't turn out like that. And you can't be too attached because cooking is dealing with variables, it's constantly changing, and you're constantly learning, so you can always get better. That's part of this journey, is just continuing to get in the kitchen and get better and become that badass pro home cook. So make sure you check out the other 2 episodes in this series and get cooking. I'll see you next time.